Well, finally, the Donald Trump administration has started to take more or less reasonable steps towards the Russian Federation. These are not sanctions yet, but it looks like these sanctions may finally appear soon. And this could happen right after the summit. But here is another key signal that the White House is slightly changing its rhetoric. This is that today the United States of America cancelled negotiations with the Russian Federation without explanation, where they were supposedly trying to find common ground. The Americans silently said no, there simply won't be a new round of negotiations with the Russians. And now the Russians started singing a completely different tune. And they say that they really hope the pause taken by the Americans won't last too long. That's what they call it, a pause. The Americans said no, there won't be any negotiations to find a normal dialogue for now. And the Russians say, oh, we really hope this is temporary. Please, don't make this pause too long. Let's discuss this topic together. This is a very interesting aspect because for the first time, Americans are directly saying no, there will be no negotiations. And sources in the White House say that after that, Trump is still ready to impose tough sanctions against Russia. They say that it finally got through to the American president that there is nothing to talk about there. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is June 16th next in order. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, the next round of negotiations between Russia and the United States on normalizing bilateral relations, which Moscow announced for the coming days, will not take place. This was announced on Monday by Mashka Zakharova, the official representative of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Washington cancelled the consultations where it was planned to discuss the removal of mutual irritants and the normalization of the work of diplomatic missions. This was stated by that same Mashka Zakharova, and she adds, "We hope that the pause they have taken will not be too long." The Americans provided no explanation, and the State Department's website had no mention of the talks. The Russians announced the negotiations, claiming they would happen soon, but the Americans denied any planned talks. What negotiations? What are we even talking about here? And here I should remind you that since the Donald Trump administration came to power, Russian and American representatives have already held face-to-face meetings at least 6 times. The first of them took place on February 18 in Riyadh and the second on February 27 in Istanbul. A month later, on March 24, the delegations of the two countries met again in the capital of Saudi Arabia. In early April, Kirill Dmitriev even flew to Washington for negotiations. He is one of dictator Putin's henchmen. And a week later, Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff came to St. Petersburg. And almost simultaneously, on April 10th, Russian and American diplomats met again in Istanbul. And just last week, the new Russian ambassador to the United States, Alexander Darchev, stated that a new round of consultations would take place in the coming days in Moscow. He said that the Americans would come to Moscow to negotiate with the Russians about how they would continue their friendship. They presented this pompously, as if the Americans themselves were saying it's okay and that they'll come to Moscow to talk. That's it. But Washington said no, there won't be any negotiations anywhere at all. For some reason, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation decided not to specify why Washington cancelled these negotiations. The talks directly dedicated to Russia-United States relations on April 10 and 27, those are April 10 and 27, ended practically without results at that time. They managed to agree on the appointment of a new Russian ambassador to Washington and the unblocking of banking services for diplomatic missions. That's all. Those are the meeting results. On the other key issues, no progress has been made so far. This is already a statement from Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. In particular, the United States refuses to lift the ban on the free movement of Russian diplomats. And let me remind you that they are only allowed to stay within a 25-mile zone around the diplomatic mission, and they are not allowed to travel further within the United States. The diplomatic mission has a boundary that cannot be crossed. Leaving this designated area is considered a violation. In addition, it turned out that Donald Trump's administration refused to return the Russian diplomatic property that had been confiscated by Barack Obama's administration. And as Ryabkov says, quote, "To put it mildly, the Russian proposal to resume direct air travel between our countries is not being received with much enthusiasm so far." Without enthusiasm, you understand? Well, and according to this new Russian ambassador to the United States, Darichev, it's to blame. The deep state and some hawks in Congress, where a stable anti-Russian lobby has formed. Well, here we go again. American sources add that during the G7 summit, the leaders of the countries may persuade President Donald Trump to put aside his hesitation and finally increase sanctions pressure on Russia. This was reported by Fred Fleitz, former national security aide to Donald Trump. According to him, the United States president feels disrespected by the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin because the Russian leader refuses to take peace negotiations with Ukraine seriously. Next, I will quote former Trump national security aide Fleitz. There is a high probability that in the next few weeks, Trump will end diplomacy and hit Russia with sanctions, but he will keep the doors open for resuming negotiations. By the way, we are seeing this now with Iran. There is a full-scale bombardment of Iran going on, and Trump says, listen, I haven't refused negotiations, but now it's going to be entirely on our terms. Well, here's an interesting point. Now, analyzing the preparations for the summit in Canada, it should be noted that the leaders of the countries will try to take advantage of Trump's mood and advance the European Union Commission's proposal to reduce the price cap on Russian oil from $60 to at least $45 per barrel. In addition, it is worth noting that on the eve of the summit, the European Union has stepped up its position on strengthening sanctions against Russia and that these are supported by the United Kingdom. At the same time, much will depend on Donald Trump's mood, and many analysts insist that he will expect personal respect from the leaders. And here he is. Fleitz added that Trump feels hatred toward the European Union, which is a risk for supporting the Europeans' positions. Let me remind you here that the leaders will discuss further sanctions against Russia if Putin does not agree to negotiations for a ceasefire against Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, announced plans for sanctions against Russia. According to her, the sanctions are crucial in the attempt to force Russia to negotiate. And by the way, Europe is already laying the groundwork to eventually convince Trump. And, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron called on the United States President to use his influence to establish peace in Russia's war against Ukraine. During his visit to Greenland, Macron stated that Trump could influence the situation, including by supporting tougher sanctions against Russia. From my point of view, the question is whether President Trump is ready to impose much tougher sanctions against Russia if Moscow does not comply with the ceasefire proposed by the United States. He further emphasized that the efforts of the summit should also be aimed at achieving a ceasefire as soon as possible. He also suggested that Trump could play a key role in de-escalating the conflict between Israel and Iran. Another one of his quotes. On this issue, the United States has a real chance to bring all parties back to the negotiating table. Israel's dependence on American weapons and ammunition gives the United States an opportunity to negotiate. But it's interesting to note that the European Union is finally acting autonomously now. The European Commission has proposed banning all new contracts for the supply of Russian gas based on trade law. This will allow bypassing a possible veto from Hungary and Slovakia. It is reported that companies are planning to be banned from signing new contracts for the supply of Russian gas with immediate effect. Short-term contracts for the import of pipeline and liquefied gas from Russia must be terminated starting from 2026, and long-term contracts will be valid until January 1 at the latest, 2028. As a concession to Hungary and Slovakia, which import Russian gas, they will be granted an exemption until 2027 to gradually phase out their existing gas contracts. But there's definitely no more room to delay, and the European Commission says there will be no new contracts. These proposals appeared after the Commission published a plan to phase out Russian oil and gas by 2027. It should be noted here that gas from Russia already accounts for less than 19% of the total fossil fuel imports to the European Union, compared to about 2/5 at the time of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. To implement this step, the European Commission intends to use trade law, which will allow a decision to be made with the approval of a majority of member states, rather than all of them. It will also refer to articles of the European Union's founding treaty, according to which the bloc's energy policy must ensure the security of supply. Companies will be required to provide customs authorities with detailed information about gas contracts to prove that the gas does not come from the Russian Federation. And finally, I will add that it is also known that United States President Donald Trump plans to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during the G7 summit in Canada. And this has already been officially announced. So we are waiting for the results of the summit, and it seems that Trump has finally started to act in the right direction. But at the very least, the Americans have cancelled talks with the Russians about normalizing relations for the first time. Well, it became obvious that negotiating normalization with abnormal people is some kind of oxymoron, and it's simply impossible to do. Well, friends, I'll leave it at that. As always, share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.